Rain battered Manila that winter night. Heavy drops ricocheted off the asphalt like small silver bullets. In the empty square, before the imposing cathedral, a solitary figure sought shelter under the small marquee of a closed shop. Juan trembled, not just from the cold penetrating his thin, worn shirt, but from the invisible weight he had carried for more than 20 years. His fingers, blackened by street dirt, clutched the only valuable object he still possessed, a rosary worn by time. The city around him continued its frantic rhythm, indifferent to his existence. The cathedral lights still shone, even at that late hour. Something in the soft golden waves escaping through the colored windows seemed to call him. A silent call, like the distant murmur of a forgotten prayer. The pain in his chest wasn't physical. It was an old wound that had never completely healed. Doctors couldn't diagnose it. Medicines from charity institutions couldn't cure it. It was a pain born of remorse, shame, and helplessness. When the rain diminished to a gentle drizzle, Juan rose with difficulty. His knees protested, worn out from nights spent sleeping on damp cardboard. His eyes, however, remained fixed on the cathedral's half-open doors. As if something beyond reason was guiding him, he crossed the square with uncertain steps. The cathedral's interior was a world apart. Empty at that hour, the silence seemed like a living entity, floating between the secular columns. Juan hesitated at the entrance, feeling like an intruder. The smell of his damp clothes contrasted with the aroma of incense and melted wax. On one of the front pews, almost imperceptible in the half-light, a solitary figure remained kneeling. He wasn't wearing the traditional cardinal vestments that would have made him stand out in a crowd. He was just a man in deep prayer, dressed in simple, discreet clothes. Cardinal Tagle had dismissed his escort for this private moment of devotion. Juan moved slowly, trying not to disturb the sanctity of the place. His steps, however, echoed off the stone walls. Small sounds that seemed to shout his inappropriate presence. The cardinal didn't turn, but his shoulders showed that he had noticed the presence of the nighttime visitor. The homeless man approached one of the distant pews, not out of devotion, but from the simple desire to sit in a dry place. The cold penetrated his bones like fine needles. His breath formed small clouds in the air, disappearing like the prayers he had long forgotten how to formulate. Minutes passed in silence. Juan observed the serene profile of the man in prayer. He didn't know that figure was Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. To him, he was just another faithful seeking spiritual comfort. His gaze traveled across the sacred images adorning the altar. Each one seemed to stare at him with eyes that knew his sins. Cardinal Tagle concluded his prayer with a discreet sign of the cross. As he rose, his gaze met that of the raggedly dressed man sitting at the back. There was no judgment in his eyes, only genuine curiosity. He walked toward Juan with calm steps, like someone approaching a wounded animal. Juan felt the impulse to flee. Good people rarely approached him voluntarily. When they did, it was with looks of distrust or superficial pity, coins thrown from a distance, as if poverty were contagious. The cardinal, however, sat on the same pew as him, respecting his distance, but close enough to share the same air. The silence between them had a different quality now. It wasn't empty or uncomfortable, but full of possibilities. The cardinal's hands rested on his knees, hands that had blessed thousands of faithful, now just a few centimeters from Juan's dirty hands. The physical proximity highlighted the social distance between them. The homeless man's eyes studied the floor. The weight of his story bore down on his hunched shoulders. 20 years on the streets had taught Juan to distrust the kindness of others. But something in the cardinal's patient silence disarmed his carefully constructed defenses. It was then that the words began to flow, not like a traditional dialogue, but like a dammed river that finally finds a crack in the barrier. One didn't know he was confessing his sins, his failures, his fears. He didn't notice the tears that now marked clean paths on his grimy face. The cardinal just listened, with the complete attention of someone who understands that listening is a sacred act. One story was like so many others and, still, unique in its pain. He had been a family man, a worker in a shoe factory, a simple life, but a dignified one. Then came alcoholism, debts, violence. On a night of blind rage, he had abandoned his wife and young son. He never returned, consumed by shame that grew proportional to his time away. Cardinal Tagle remained motionless, but his eyes revealed the deep empathy of a heart accustomed to carrying others' pains. He offered no easy absolutions or superficial advice. His presence was like a candle in the darkness. It doesn't eliminate all the shadows, but offers reference enough for the next step. One's hands trembled as he revealed his greatest regret, never having sought to know if his son had grown up well, if he was still alive, if he forgave him. The fear of rejection had become a prison without walls, more efficient than any real jail. The words came out broken, like shattered pieces of a mirror that would never again reflect a complete image. Outside, the night advanced. Cathedral staff passed by discreetly, casting curious glances at the unusual scene. The cardinal, with a minimal gesture, indicated they should not be interrupted. At that moment, the cathedral was not just a religious building, but an improvised confessional where a soul exposed its deepest wounds. When he finally exhausted his words, one felt a strange relief, as if he had carried a stone for decades and, suddenly, set it down. He didn't expect forgiveness or miracles. In fact, he didn't even know that the patient man beside him was one of the most important figures of the Catholic Church in Asia. To him, he was just someone who had done what few had done in his life. Listen. Dawn found Juan sleeping in one of the simple rooms of the episcopal residence adjacent to the cathedral. The cardinal had insisted, not with words of authority, but with gestures of genuine concern. A hot bath, clean clothes, a real bed. Small luxuries that had become strange to the man from the streets. Cardinal Tagle moved with discreet purpose. Phone calls were made, documents consulted. His team, accustomed to his unlikely initiatives, followed his instructions without question. Juan's full name, his hometown, the last known address of his family. Fragments of information that could be the difference between despair and redemption. In his simple office, the cardinal studied old photographs and yellowed documents. The church's record system was surprisingly efficient at preserving stories of common lives. Meanwhile, Juan explored the small internal garden of the residence. His fingers, now clean, touched the petals of flowers whose names he had forgotten. He seemed like a man displaced in time, as if he had awakened after a long and terrible nightmare. The following days passed in a strangely comforting routine. The cardinal had included Juan in the simple tasks of the house. Watering plants, organizing books, small repairs. It wasn't charity disguised as work, but a path to recover the dignity lost in the streets. At meals, they sat at the same table. The cardinal, without fanfare, was restoring not just Juan's body, but his humanity. Meanwhile, a few kilometers away, in a modest neighborhood, a young teacher received an unexpected letter. His hands trembled as he recognized a name he hadn't heard in 2 decades. His eyes traveled over the lines written in Cardinal Tagle's elegant handwriting. There was no emotional manipulation or empty promises in those words, just the simple news. His father was alive and desired his forgiveness, even without the courage to ask for it personally. Weeks turned into months. Juan now occupied a small room at the back of one of the shelter houses maintained by the archdiocese. He worked in maintenance of the place, his hands now calloused from honest effort, not from the harshness of the streets. The cardinal visited regularly, not as an authority supervising a project, but as a friend accompanying a journey. The letters from Juan's son began hesitantly, words carefully chosen, measuring the emotional distance. The cardinal served as a silent mediator, never interfering with the content, just facilitating communication. He noticed how Juan read and reread each message, as if trying to recover the lost years between the written lines. In the community, the transformation of that once invisible man didn't go unnoticed. Children who once crossed the street to avoid him now greeted him by name. Ladies who protected their purses in his presence now shared homemade bread with him after Massachusetts. It wasn't just Juan who was transforming, but the social fabric around him. Cardinal Tagle observed everything with the serenity of one who understands that some seeds need time to germinate. He never publicly mentioned Juan's story, respecting the privacy of that soul in reconstruction. In meetings with religious leaders and authorities, however, he used the experience as an anonymous example of the need to look beyond appearances. In his private prayers, the cardinal reflected on that rainy night in the cathedral. How small choices, staying a little longer in prayer, welcoming a ragged stranger, could trigger profound transformations. There were no spectacular miracles in that story, just the everyday miracle of persistent compassion. And perhaps, he thought, that was exactly what the world needed most. The news arrived on a Sunday morning. Juan's son had decided to come to Manila. He didn't promise reconciliation, just a meeting, enough for Juan's heart to accelerate with a mixture of hope and terror. His hands, accustomed to fixing broken objects, seemed unable to fix his own story. Cardinal Tagle offered the garden of his residence for the meeting, a neutral, serene location, protected from curious eyes. He would not be present. He understood that some journeys, no matter how much we accompany them in their first steps, must be completed alone. That morning, he celebrated a special Mass, asking for strength for father and son. The moment came like a wave that forms slowly on the horizon. Juan waited sitting on a wooden bench, under the shade of an ancient mango tree. His son, now a 30-year-old man, approached with measured steps. The resemblance between them was disconcerting. The same eyes, the same face shape, like a mirror reflecting different versions of the same essence. There were no immediate embraces or easy tears. The conversation began hesitantly, like someone testing the solidity of ground after an earthquake. Difficult words were spoken, painful truths confronted. The son spoke of childhood marked by absence, of the mother who never fully recovered, of birthdays spent looking at the door, waiting for someone who never came. Then, in the most unexpected moment, it happened. The son removed a small package from his bag. It was a child's drawing, preserved for 2 decades. It showed stick figures, a man, a woman, a child, a family. The title, written with the wavering calligraphy of a 5-year-old child, "When Daddy Returns." One couldn't contain his tears. His son, after a moment of hesitation, extended his hand. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was a beginning, a possible path through the desert of guilt. Cardinal Tagle observed from a distance the simple ceremony. Juan, now with well-groomed grey hair, was receiving his certificate of completion from the rehabilitation program. 2 years had passed since that night in the cathedral, years of patient reconstruction, of stumbles and new beginnings. In the front row, his son applauded discreetly, next to his wife and a 5-year-old girl, the granddaughter that Juan was just beginning to know. No one beyond the Cardinal and those directly involved knew the whole story. For the world, it was just another case of successful recovery among so many others. Nothing especially noteworthy for headlines or public recognition. The true magnitude was in the invisible details. The nights when one fought against the impulse to return to the streets, the difficult conversations with his son, the long process of accepting himself as deserving of a second chance. After the ceremony, one approached the Cardinal. They didn't need many words. His eyes now carried a dignity that no external circumstance could confer or take away. He handed the religious man a small object, the worn rosary he had carried that rainy night, a symbol of the journey traveled, of faith rediscovered not in empty rituals, but in the concrete love that transforms. The afternoon sun cast long shadows in the courtyard. One's granddaughter ran between them, creating her own game of light and darkness. The Cardinal watched her with a serene smile. He thought about how generations intertwine, how wounds can transform into scars that, although permanent, no longer cause pain, how redemption rarely comes in grand gestures, but in the daily persistence of choosing love despite fear. The following week, while celebrating Mass in the same cathedral where everything had begun, Cardinal Tagle spoke about unexpected encounters, about being present at the right moment, about listening without haste. He didn't mention names or identifiable details. He didn't need to. The true lesson was in the space between his words, in the ever-present possibility that each encounter, no matter how casual it seems, carries the potential to change a life, or two, or more, in invisible waves that spread through time, like rain falling on the ocean, each drop indistinguishable, but each one eternally altering its composition. If you like this kind of story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos.